What's up, everybody? Welcome to Omnic Lab. This is episode number 85. We're a podcast that focuses on the strategies inside the game of Overwatch. We'll help you learn through trial and error in the lab, just like we do every week, even if things get a bit crazy and blow up. This week, we've got some really cool stuff to equip you, the listeners, with some instruments to get a strategic edge. We're talking advanced aiming theory. And before you run away and throw full wine bottles at your screens, the the aim theory is not so advanced that any player would not benefit from this. This is a scalable learning exercise that we're really excited to teach you some techniques with. And we brought in a special Reddit Grandmaster player, Daniel, or Burdock, in the Discord. Burdock, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, Andres actually found him and reached out, and I'll introduce our other co-host, Andres from Georgia. What's up, Andres?
Hey, how's it going? Glad to be here as well. Yeah, we found Daniel, or Burdock, on Reddit. He had posted a really cool aiming guide that I thought it was really interesting because he was talking about aiming terms that don't get thrown around or get thrown around a lot, but there's not a lot of theory or explanations behind them. So I feel like some of these terms kind of just get thrown around willy-nilly, but there's not a knowledge base behind it. So I think that it's cool to maybe turn the conversation into that side and maybe touch aiming from a different perspective, a little more in-depth, a little more nuanced perspective. And I think that this episode is going to be really cool for a lot of people who are trying to improve mechanically and just at a personal level and theory level.
Absolutely. So this week we also have been trying to take in some more feedback on how to restructure the show. So we're going to do something we decided outside of the show. Andres and I are planning to do all of the news at the end. And at the beginning, we're going to do sponsors and a heads update, and then news at the end after the topic. So we'll basically just jump right in. So here we go. Game night, we're looking for a date. We're still looking for the final weekend in January, but just keep it in mind, we don't have it locked in yet. If you guys are looking for the show, the best podcasting app out there, as per last episode, is Overcast for freebies and Pocket Cast for paid if you guys are looking for good podcasting apps. Omnic Meta is our official partner of the show, with Switchfox in our Discord as an admin. If you guys want to look up more information on hero pick rates and some of the impacts thereof, you can go check that out at omnicmeta.com. We have our... I don't really even know what to call it, but kind of our OWL extension of Omnic Lab, the Overwatch show. League recap. Sister show, sort of. Yeah, there you go. So Overwatch League recap is also going to be they just released their episode, I think yesterday or 2 days ago. If you guys want to stay caught up on the last show before the real season kicks off, you can go check that out at Omnic Lab or Overwatch League or OWL recap on Twitter or over OWLrecap.com. And we actually have our first sponsorship that we've locked in. And a special shout out to Ben Wiggins, who is putting this together. So I'll give him his blurb. Top Score Solutions. We also wanted to tell you guys about this partnership for 2018 with Top Score. He's one of our longtime patrons, Ben, a.k.a. I Need Peeling in the Discord, or as he's known on Reddit, is offering a free business consulting for esports. If you are an aspiring coach, you're wanting to start a team, or you're developing an app or service, trying to boost your subscriber base, or even you just want to work a little bit more in esports, you can visit his website, topscoresolutions.com, or you can get him on Twitter, which is probably best right now currently, at Topscore Esports. Or you can join our Discord server and PM I Need Peeling for more information. He has a master's degree in sports management and an MBA in the same field. And has a lot of business and marketing experience, and his services are actually free. So we want to make sure that we highlight that. If you guys are wanting to access him, now is the time, because it's a new startup and all of the services are free. So please go check him out. Andres and I will be searching and using this for a little bit here in the beginning stages to see how we can benefit from it as well. And last up, we have Patreon. Patreon, we have a few updates to those of you who are joining in this week. We have Golden Soldier and Shazir joining the Diamond Patron Squad. Thank you guys so much for your support, as well as Grant G joining the Patreon team. Thank you guys for being scientists and more than just lab rats. We appreciate that. And then furthermore, we have our Diamond sponsors in addition to that, which are Chris to Play, Good Apollo, Great Root Bear, Kip with 5 P's, Lissum, he told me how to pronounce it this week, Magic, Matt R, Never Clutch, Ricky Ticky, and Tragic Zach. Thank you guys so much for your continued support of the show. It helps us honestly pay for BlizzCon, and it is not cheap. So we really, really appreciate that, as well as upgrading our equipment. But without further ado, let's get into aim theory. Andres, kick us off.
Sounds good. Yeah, let's kick things off. First of all, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself so the audience knows? Burdock, what do you like playing? What heroes are you playing? Maybe at what elo do you play? And maybe a little background into your FPSs. I know you're a guy that goes a long way back.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now I'm sitting at, depending on the account and play style, somewhere between GM and top 500, around the 4,200 to 4,400 range. Actually, probably people know me best for playing blah and probably bothering some streamers.
You said that's the account where you only say blah, right?
Yeah, and then eventually I got tired of it, so I stopped.
It seems like a very bland account, yeah.
Yeah. I think my girlfriend thanks me for it, but completely lost my mind. But and before Overwatch, I played quite a few things. A bit of StarCraft, as well as before that, some Tribes, of which probably most of the people that I currently play with know me for, as well as a bit of a few other games here and there, like NS2, or Natural Selection 2, which was really, really short-lived, but I think there's... I need to go through the list, but actually quite a few Overwatch pros I ended up knowing from that.
Oh,
Tribes,
nice.
Which is a little bit funny how that happens. Yeah, I mean, these things can often be a little bit of old boys networks because people usually stick around for a little while.
And it makes sense, right?
Sure.
Like if you make a group of friends that plays a game a lot and then a new game comes out and they start playing the game, it makes sense that you kind of move on with them too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, I have a buddy of mine, Silver J, that play with a number of stuff, and he's also pretty good friends with Tavik. So, like, we'll be when he isn't playing the 14 hours a day of Overwatch, playing a bit of things like Smite or WoW together. And
cool.
Nice. It's interesting to see how much bleed between genres the gaming communities can have, especially on the pro scene, because really up until now. Well, even now, the pro scenes are relatively small in player counts. So the support staff with the people that are actually pros or the ones that have scrimmed with them, or a lot of people know each other.
And we were talking about this yesterday, where we were talking about how a lot of pros in certain games, even cross genres, tend to kind of go pro in like different games, right? Like if they're already playing at a really high elo at a really high level in one game, sometimes it's easy for them to translate into another game, and it's part of like the discussion we're having on improving and becoming a better player, because there's skills that you can develop, right? They're almost like learning skills, the ability to learn patterns and pick up on things very quickly that allows some of these players to kind of like do that cross game thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of good examples of that. For example, like the Overwatch community. Not sure how many people are familiar with Huck. He was a pro StarCraft 2 player.
Right, and he's now a caster too, and he's been a coach for teams and a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, and he's also like, I think he plays like low GM. He's around like high masters, low GM.
He played for Canada, right, for the team.
Yeah, I believe so. Canada. And he's a very considering the relatively small amount of time he's put into FPS games and Overwatch, he's a very strong player. Another example is like I have one of the people I play with, Silver Jade. He's been really high level in pretty much every. He's probably the most terrifying gamer I know. Period. I think he's gotten to be rank 1 in PvP at some point in almost every MMO I'm aware of, and then get bored and play a different one. Dang. He also got rank 1 in Smite, playing support. No, I think he swapped to DPS at the end, and did that and then stopped playing. And he played Overwatch for 1 season and touched GM. So like that, there are certain people that are very good at getting good at games, even cross genres, and a lot of it comes down to, well, it's sort of 2 things. First off is that learning a game, a lot of it just comes down to being consistent with progression, because it's really easy to hit plateaus, and the sort of learning progression for a lot of people when they get into games is that you play and you hit that sort of plateau, and at some point you learn a lot, and in 1 season or the span of a few weeks you might move from, let's say, gold to low plat, a large jump. It's not usually super incremental. Usually it's some sort of significant jump. And you look back and think about how much you sucked. And that's usually the process when it comes to learning this kind of stuff. And it's really, it is sort of integral to the sort of methodology of it too, is that if you're very, very comfortable with your current play and you're not criticizing yourself, especially having some sort of short feedback cycles, the sort of idea of like, oh, I'm missing shots, and that's sort of a very short feedback cycle. You shoot, you miss, and then you realize you missed. But then there's the stuff that's a little bit harder, like, in StarCraft, for example, you can lose a game. You can make a decision that loses you a game 10 minutes later, and it's kind of hard to associate. So people that are really good at learning games are really good at being able to go back, comb over their own games, or in the moment, and be able to identify mistakes, and then just build good habits. Because there's some people that are really good at identifying those mistakes, but then they don't turn it into good habits. And unfortunately, with pretty much every game outside of maybe chess and Go, you're not really in a position to think about your decisions a whole lot. I mean, you're mostly relying on habits and being able to make quick judgment calls. I don't think in Overwatch I've ever had any amount of time to be able to discuss and tabulate any sort of decision on any level.
But by the time you're discussing it, you're already dead.
Yeah. It's not like, hey, should I peek around this corner or should I not? You never have those kind of opportunities. Like, you're never in the middle of overextending and ask your team, hey, am I overextending right now? You're already probably dead.
Yeah.
So
yep.
There's this weird disconnect where you have to go from being able to identify mistakes and then be able to actually sort of feel those mistakes, is how I would just describe it. Like, in the moment, sort of like have that feeling that you're making a mistake, or quickly afterwards knowing that you're making a mistake, and then just building a good habit off of that. Stuff that's easy to do this is like misusing abilities, like you miss a flash, like that's a really short feedback cycle. It's really easy to identify the mistake, and that's why people get good at it. Like, I can't think of very many McCrees at any level that don't very quickly learn how to like flash over a Rhine shield. That isn't that challenging. But positioning is something that is notoriously difficult to learn. And it's just because you move out of position and then you might die like 15, 20 seconds later because of it, and there's not a good association between that.
It takes a lot of time and a lot of games to start building like those good habits. I definitely agree.
Yeah.
And that's why we have you here. Actually, we want to focus on a particular topic, the topic of aim. I think that there's a lot of nuances to the topic of aim. And like we said, there's a lot of things that get thrown around, but people don't take the time sometimes to really think about them. And sometimes it takes another person to show them or to point to certain things for people to go, oh, you're right. I had never thought about maybe trying it to do it with that style. So this is a good point to maybe go ahead and jump into the topic itself. I know that there's some aiming terms that we can go through so that everyone can understand and be kind of the same page of the conversation. You want to go through a few of them?
Yeah, absolutely. So sort of the general idea of why to even break this down in the first place is that sort of to unblack box the process of aim and mechanics in general, because it's really easy for people to talk about like, oh, that person has good aim, or oh, that person has bad aim, and this sort of very nebulous term, sort of like bad positioning, when it has a lot of different component parts to it, of which is worth understanding to be able to sort of be able to improve your own gameplay, as well as just to understand that this isn't necessarily something that's completely based off of just sheer reflexes, hand-eye coordination, reaction time.
Yeah, there's a lot of theory behind it, and there's a lot of thought process. And sometimes, like, building good habits makes a person aim better. It's not so much about the quick reflexes or inhuman speed, but more about sometimes about prediction or being smart with your movement.
Yeah, I think, like, in all honesty, especially in a game like Overwatch, where it is not so much of a twitch shooter, where you can have a lot of control over how engagements play out, things like positioning, prediction, and your own movement matters significantly more than reaction time and hand-eye coordination. I mean, as long as most players have the reaction time and the hand-eye coordination to be able to be at a GM's level of aim. Like that's very, very rarely the issue. At least in my experience, a lot of the player base is not somebody that has like a 300, 400 millisecond reaction time.
Right. Also, another thing that I've noticed too is that a lot of these terms and a lot of this theory, it's more of a word of mouth kind of thing, right? Like you hear it on streams, you hear it other players talk about it. Like you said, you've been playing some of these games for a long time. You play a little Quake, you told me, and some of these terms are as old as FPSs themselves, but there's not a lot of like written guides about it. So sometimes it's more of like I said, a word of mouth kind of knowledge that gets passed down. So hopefully we can put it a little more structure to that today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we can jump into it. Going down the list of the original post that originally talked a little bit about the different styles of aiming, which the main four that at least I chose to discuss being placing, strafing, and tracking and flicking, which I imagine at some point all of you have heard at least some of these terms in streams or from other players.
Yeah. Some of them are very popular, like tracking or flicking are things that get thrown around in the community a lot. Placing and strafing, a little more nuanced, but I think that some of you might have heard them.
Yeah, so I guess we can jump right into it here.
Let's run through
placing. Yeah, so placing, just to go over the definition, is essentially like, if you've ever heard of crosshair placement, this is much more popular in games like CSGO, where you have much more low time to kill, like one-shot headshots and that kind of stuff. But crosshair placement is important nonetheless in most games, which is essentially where a lot of pre-aiming, when you know something's going to happen, whether it be a corner that you're holding or just predicting somebody moving into cover, or any sort of thing where you know that you should be looking in some general area, where you're keeping your crosshair in the correct place. A really good example of this is like people that walk around in games with their crosshair below head level. They're just staring at the ground, and it's this minor point that, oh, well, you're just looking down too far. But in a game like Overwatch, where most people have relatively similar head levels, that having your crosshair off of that head level is just putting you at a disadvantage. Flicks are going to be longer. It's going to be harder to be able to track. You're putting yourself at a slight disadvantage simply by just looking in the wrong place to begin with.
Yeah, basically it's talking about placing your cursor where you will think that the action will be happening, and like the optimal place where the action will be happening, where you have the easiest time aiming, where you basically just have to click the fire button and you will be hitting somebody. Another good example of placing, it happens a lot in the Widow versus Widow battles, for example. Once you have that standoff of both Widows looking at each other, both of them kind of know where the head level of the other Widow is. So they'll just place the cursor in a place where they think the Widow will pop off of a corner or something. And the second that Widow pops off, they just press the fire button and you get that headshot right there. You didn't even have to move the cursor. You place it in the place where you thought she was going to come out. And the only thing you had to do was click it when you see the model cross the cursor.
And it's really fantastic.
There's another area that you can use for placing, just to give another example for those of you that are not familiar with it in a different context. I know that for me, if you're playing a projectile hero, a lot of times, especially if heroes are jumping around, you can place your crosshair on a place where somebody is jumping to, like say they're jumping off of high ground onto low ground. You can basically predict where they're going to move, put your crosshair at head level when they land, and pre-fire in order to hit them when they land by placing your crosshair where they're going, because they can't necessarily dictate where they're going to land every single time, if that makes sense. So, not in most cases, the heroes will be able to land in the same spot every time, given their trajectory. You can predict where they're going to land, so you pre-move beforehand, and that's kind of the gist of placement.
Yeah, and these are great examples of this sort of purest form of using crosshair placement, where you're in a situation where you literally don't need to move your crosshair at all. And these are the sort of optimal sort of things. That like this list actually has an order to it. The whole placing, strafing, tracking, and flicking, because they're actually like listed from most consistent to least consistent. And if you can just place your crosshair somewhere and let somebody walk into it, those shots are going to be by far the most consistent. Now, unfortunately, you're not always going to be in that situation, especially with like if you're thinking about heroes like, let's say, Zarya, where you can think of, okay, well, I have a beam weapon. How does this really help me? That crosshair placement can just be sort of a part of the process as well. A good example of this is just making sure that you're aiming at corners at where people are going to come around, because if you're having to flick to them, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. And it's surprising how many people do this. It is something where in like FPS games, it's notorious for people to just sort of walk around looking at their feet, where they're looking like about 30 degrees off the horizon level. And it's really interesting because I don't think people think about it that much. They think about looking around like this sort of visual piece of things where you're looking around and there's no sort of aim process. It's just observing what's happening. And then there's the transition to, oh, it's a fight. I'm moving my screen and my crosshair in accordance to shoot with people. But the reality is that where you look and for observing things and where you're planning on shooting sort of go hand in hand.
Oh, absolutely. Like we've talked about this in the show. We've called it framing, trying to frame the action, the way you frame yourself, and the stuff that you're looking at the battle matters a lot, right? It matters how much you have to move your cursor to flick to somebody, for example. If you're looking at the wrong spot, that's going to be a lot of a harder turn than if you're looking at the right spot and you just have to do a small adjustment, for example.
Yeah, I mean, you can really notice this when you're watching very, very strong hit scan players basically enter an area. So a good example of this is, let's say, King's Row. Let's say you're a McCree player and you're walking onto the point while you're doing an aggressive push. Players that are less experienced, I mean, heck, even in all the way up to like Masters and such, they often will have a little bit of just looking around, where maybe they look up a little bit to the right, up a little bit to the left, where their crosshair isn't on anything necessarily relevant at the time. They might be looking at like the back of their Rhine or maybe the statue that's in the middle of King's Row. But if you go watch some programs from the perspective of a McCree just walking onto the point, what they're going to do is they're going to immediately go out, they're going to look down mid, they're going to look at the left-hand door right at the head level that somebody can be in that little area. They might look at the high ground right around at the head level, and then they'll look at the backside where a Widow might be. That the looking movements are much more controlled, and they're looking at places where people might be, so that they don't have to waste the time to be able to move their mouse to the person if they are there. That or CS:GO is an even better example of this, since it's super refined with a lot of these players, because there's less places somebody can be. That they often know that like there's 5 or 6 places somebody could be standing when walking into a room. So you just look at those places and don't have any sort of static cursor or extra movement between those. It's really interesting to watch, and something that you might have some value just going back and watching a pro game or a perspective of a high level player and see how they approach walking into a room.
Definitely. A good example of this, a current one too. If you guys watch the Houston Outlaws recently released a video of their team playing a 1v1 tournament for fun. It's a very casual thing. It's like a 10-minute video. It's like for funsies basically. But in one of the plays, you have, I think, Muma versus Jake, and they're playing a Widowmaker battle. And there's a point where Jake is hiding behind a wall, and there's like 3 places where he can come. In the bottom, there's like a right and left that he can come from. And at the top, there's like a top left place where he can come from. And a regular player, I think, would maybe aim at one of these locations and wait for him to pop out and kill him. But Muma, just knowing Jake and knowing that Jake is a master of disguise kind of thing, he's not going to be predictable. He's not going to come from the angle that you think. Instead, what he does is, instead of aiming at any of the door or any of the places where he can come, he aims in the centermost spot where he can basically flick to any of these locations at about the same distance. So he's aiming at like a wall that makes no sense. Like nobody's going to come through there.
Maximize peripheral vision.
But he's equidistant from basically all of the locations where Jake can come from. And I thought that was really smart of him. I can't remember how that ends up turning out, but I just remember him
Link's
making the
Bastion
adjustment.
duel was really good to watch too.
Oh
the
yeah,
Bastion
that
duel
one was
insane.
too. Yeah. That's a really good one to watch. Like really good habits of players. But let's keep it moving over here. Let's move on to the next one. Strafing. Let's talk about strafing a little bit.
Yeah, so strafing is a relatively short topic that mostly comes down to taking any sort of engagement where you're currently in the fight and you're having to be able to compensate for somebody's movement. And in this game, everyone has roughly the same movement speed. I think it's all characters except for Tracer and Genji have 5.5 meters per second, and Genji and Tracer have 6. But generally speaking, if you are moving in the left or right direction, it will be compensating for the movement of anybody else moving in the left or right direction. So this is something that you can easily abuse to just reduce the apparent motion of somebody else. So if you're Tracer and you sneak up behind somebody and they're running, you can just match their movement speed and they're going to be not moving as much on your screen. Another example of this is when people are 80-80 spamming, that if you are essentially stutter stepping where they're like moving back and forth repeatedly, it can sometimes be hard to just compensate completely with your mouse. A lot of people overcompensate and try to completely track that movement, and that's a losing battle because the human reaction time, even if you're the fastest person on the planet, you're still going to be about 120 milliseconds behind the other person. So you can't track it completely. So being able to, let's say if you're a Tracer sneaking up behind somebody, reducing the amount of mouse motion that you have and trying to match their motion with just basically strafing can be advantageous, especially in like long range battles too, where let's say somebody's standing still, it's actually better to just, if you're off somebody's head by a small amount, let's say with Widowmaker, you can just strafe into their head instead of necessarily moving your mouse at all. Because even if you're on the lowest sensitivity humanly imaginable, moving a single head distance at long range is actually quite difficult to be consistent. Yeah. And you strafe, like, you move at the same speed you do no matter how much you're zoomed in down a scope. That you move at a that if you press A or D, you're going to be on that person's head within about a half a second. If you don't quite have it lined up, and
it's a smaller really movement, a little more subtle too, right?
Yeah, if you want to do subtle movements, strafing
sometimes.
is fantastic.
Plus, when you're doing 80 strafing, it's you have a muscle memory on how that movement is going to be, and when you press A or D, it's always the same movement. But with your mouse, it more depends on your wrist movement, and it's a little bit harder to control because it's not a machine creating the movement for you. It's your own hand, so it's prone to some errors.
There is a really good training room practice for this to get down the absolute fundamentals, where you go to the training bots that don't move in the space on the left. There are the 2 training bots sitting in the alcove. You can basically stand a certain distance away that you're comfortable with and just walk left and right with A and D and just track the head of the bot and then move closer to them and go in at a closer distance where you have to swing your mouse more, move back in a further area, and you have to track them with less mouse movement. These are all very good things you can do, and then you can intermingle using W and S while strafing left and right to go forward and backwards on this and adjust your aim accordingly. It's a really, really good warm-up drill and a good way to kind of see where you're struggling with your strafing. Are you struggling in the more close quarters fights? Are you struggling in the long distance ones? Generally speaking, you're going to struggle more with more mouse movement in this type of a drill because everyone's movement is like Burdock was saying, is equidistant and equal in predictability, aside from Tracer Genji.
Yeah, but even then, it's not as significant enough of a difference that you can still do minor compensation with your other movement. But generally speaking, especially if your character is like Genji or Tracer or Widow, you're really going to want to use strafing to your advantage when you can. I think that probably the best example of this is Tracer. Like if you're a Tracer placer and not taking advantage of this, you are shooting yourself in the foot.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the next one, tracking.
Yeah, so tracking is something that people start talking about it as like the purest form of aim, when in many ways it's the complete opposite. Tracking has almost everything to do with knowing the move speed, the fall speed, and the speed of every ability in the game to the point where you just can track it. I think probably everyone's seen some of the clips of like Defran absolutely demolishing a Widowmaker that grapples, or somebody that's falling. That's really, really consistent with being able to track targets like that.
Yeah.
But when somebody has consistent movement, if you play this game long enough and practice, that it's easy to just know that movement and be able to repeat it. It's sort of like doing the same sort of motion over and over again. And it's something that you can absolutely ingrain. That tracking has a lot to do with predictions and being able to essentially just predict how the enemy is going to move. There's some exceptions to this, like AD spamming. Your reaction time plays a slightly larger role, but the reality is that there's other techniques you can use to win AD, like those sort of fights that have more of an impact than your reaction time when it comes to tracking.
Even those fights, even when people are AD spamming, really good players can start finding patterns even in those, and they can kind of find the rhythm of some of these players and just follow that rhythm, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it depends on what you're playing. Like, let's say you're doing McCree in an AD spamming battle. A lot of McCrees will just basically not move their crosshair and just wait for the other person to walk over it, because it's relatively easy just to hold it almost completely still and just wait for them to strafe over it. Yeah, so you basically just do very, very subtle motions to make sure that you're actually like hitting people. With Soldier, we'll cover this a little bit later about the hitboxes, but there's very few times where you even want to take a fight where you're AD strafing against another soldier. Usually what's going to happen is you like shoot a helix rock at their feet, you pop them in the air, and you land like a headshot, and they're dead. So there's very few situations where you're in these kind of fights that are the equivalent to, like in Quake, there's a beam rifle that's sort of like Zarya's beam, that where people might run into each other and just track with that. And that in Quake, which is even much more reliant on reaction time and aim than Overwatch is, the best players were not necessarily the people that were best at tracking with the beam weapons. Actually, very rarely did it come down to that, because there's so many things that happen before you even get into that situation. That being said, if you want to get better at tracking, get really used to people that aren't AD spamming, because that's where it's going to matter a lot more, is just getting very used to move speeds, getting very used to fall speeds, and being very calm and precise with your motions, because you can pretty much memorize most of the move speeds in this game.
For sure. All right, and the last one, and probably the flashiest of all, that's sometimes the one that makes it to Reddit the most, is flicking.
Yes. So flicking is, and why it's the last thing on this list, is because it's the least consistent. And it's generally speaking something you want to combine with all of these. Like, if you're not tracking your targets and you're trying to flick half of your screen, you're doing something wrong. I mean, if you're not placing roughly where the person's going to be and you have to do a half a screen flick, you're probably doing something wrong. And that's why everyone plays with that. Well, I shouldn't say everyone. A lot of people play with relatively low sensitivities in this game compared to, let's say, well, I can't actually find an example of an SPS game with really high sensitivity, but
it's because it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I can't actually think of it, but like, people aren't usually playing this game at like 2000 DPI and 15 in game. Even the people with high sensitivity is only like 1500 EDPI, which is still pretty high. But
that's pretty high.
Anyway, that I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But when we're talking about flicking, that the reason people do it is because sometimes when you're dealing with a lot of erratic movement, it's easier just to basically flick to somebody with a low rate of fire weapon the moment that they are somewhere and just shoot at it, where they don't have they aren't easily able to change their movement direction by the time you actually finish the flick. There's really only a couple things that are really important to understand about flick shotting. First thing is that pretty much everyone resets after flicking, where basically they'll move back in the opposite direction after they flick. So let's say they're flicking to the left, they might move back slightly to the right after they make the shot. And the reason for this is sort of twofold. First off is that, like, whenever you flick, it's almost completely with your wrist. And if you're in an extended wrist position, your aim is going to be a hell of a lot worse than if it's in like just a neutral position. So essentially like just straight forward. So a lot of people will just basically bring their hand back to that neutral position. And then the reason
to help garner consistency with something that is
because if somebody else
so
that the next shot they're doing the same sort of motion, because with flick shotting, a lot of that like muscle memory comes from moving your wrist from a neutral position to some sort of extended position in very fixed distances.
Right.
If you watch somebody doing aim training, that they might vary in the distance they're flicking, but a lot of times it's roughly the same. Like it's the same speed, the same motion over and over and over again with slightly different distances.
And they're still tracking, but they're not necessarily tracking with where the crosshair is. They're tracking with their eyes so that they can flick to the location of what they're hitting.
And we'll cover that in a little bit with the sort of general advice. But the other reason is that people usually favor one direction over the other. For example, like right-handed people usually like flicking inward. So essentially, like whatever handed you are, flicking towards the keyboard or towards your thumb is often more comfortable for people. That being said, it's like some people it's the other way around. But either way, people often favor one direction over the other. So doing that slight reset not only makes it easier to line up the next shot due to a neutral position, but it also means that you're generally flicking in the same direction over and over again. So that's because usually it's enough of a distance that somebody's not going to get to the other side.
To put a close on this real quick, as we move into general advice, because I think we've got the broad brushstrokes, so you can go into more specifics here. There is an excellent guide that I've linked in the Reddit thread that you wrote here, is in our show notes, or also if you're in the Twitch chat, it's there. I can repost it again. But there's a video link under flicking where Time is kind of executing it and displaying how he's doing it. And he's one of the few people that likes to flick the opposite way. That's typically natural. He likes to flick from left to right, even though he's right-handed.
That's right. And just also to close out this little topic over here, these are all styles of aiming that you should be using in tandem with each other. They're not like exclusive from one another. You should be switching from one another constantly, and know that certain heroes favor some of these styles more than others. Like you said, Tracer, for example, can use strafing as a form of aiming quite a bit to her advantage. Maybe Widowmaker is going to be looking to do placing and maybe flicking a little more, like was with McCree. But maybe if you're playing Winston, and quotes here, aiming with Winston, but aiming with Winston is all about it's all about placing, right? And there is some nuances with how you aim with Winston. It's not just like do whatever kind of thing.
Yeah, and this is something where a lot of what's going to make you better at any individual one of these is more effectively using it in tandem with the others. Like flicking is going to be a lot easier for you if you are pre-aiming positions, so you don't have to flick long distances. You're going to be better at flicking also if you're predicting where your enemies are coming from too, because if you're practiced with tracking and you know the fall speed of people and that kind of stuff, you're going to be more consistent with your flick shots because, well, when you're flicking, you don't really see anything. You're moving too quickly on your screen, so you're still having to compensate for movement. On whether it's consciously or unconsciously, you still are compensating for motion a bit as well. Mm-hmm. So being good at using these together is going to make you a lot stronger than any of them individually.
Right.
Strafing, for example, like strafing with McCree against somebody that's moving in the same direction is going to reduce their apparent motion, which is going to make flicking easier. So just use the right tool at the right time is the biggest thing with these. But
that is correct. And practice them all.
Yeah, I think probably
let's
the biggest
get into
thing...
general advice, and you can just go at it.
Yeah, okay.
You just start getting it.
So the biggest one that is really unfortunate to see is aim with your eyes. Look around. That you're not supposed to be staring at your crosshair in this game or any FPS game, and it's going to lower your awareness, and it's going to make you just a worse shot in general. People get really good at things like flicking and tracking by keeping their eyes on the thing that's moving, because your reaction time for eyes and motion is substantially faster than with your hand. And there's a reason it's called hand-eye coordination. There's a reason that people look at balls that are being thrown at them, because pretty well the brain is wired to do that. So if you're staring at your crosshair, you're lowering your situational awareness and you're making your aim worse, and just don't do it. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Just don't do it. Look at the thing you're trying to shoot, even if it's not at the center of your screen.
Yeah, no, and it's very true. Like, especially at the lower elos, oftentimes, and sometimes even at the higher elos too, but you'll see like an Anna or a Widowmaker that are so focused on their scope that sometimes don't even realize there's like a Genji or a Winston like literally right beside them, and they're about to die.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something where you really do want to sort of free the things you're looking at and paying attention to from your crosshair. And combining this with the placing side of things, that you'll notice that, as I was mentioning before, where like very, very strong players enter a room and that they check certain corners and things, that usually they'll look with their eyes and then while they're still moving their crosshair, and that there's a certain almost methodical scanning of a room or scanning of the environment that occurs for people that are more practiced with the maps, know where people are and know where to look, and that it seems like somebody can engage incredibly quickly. Like if you've played against somebody that's significantly higher ELO than you might see them walk into a room and then immediately identify you and kill you, and it's absolutely terrifying sometimes to see people like Effect go absolutely ham on people that were supposedly had the defender's advantage, and it's just because these people are really, really good at being able to scan the important areas and see a person and react to it very, very quickly,
very fast.
And,
so aim with your eyes.
Yeah, I guess that's the main point. Is just look where you're shooting.
Right.
So the second one, and this might seem incredibly obvious, but know what the enemy wants to do, because quite often, if you want to make good predictions, it's not just based on what their current motion is, but just sort of identifying what they're actually doing. Like if somebody's low health and running into cover, you know exactly what's going to happen. They're going to try and run behind that cover, and you can use a lot of these tools, like for example, just putting your cursor directly in front of them and just letting them walk over it. Or you can be very, very consistent with your tracking or whatever, because you know that they're just trying to run into cover. And this can become pretty much automatic at a point where you see somebody that's low health, and then you just basically let them walk over your crosshair as they run into cover. And especially with characters like McCree or Widowmaker that are low rate of fire, this can be a really, really strong technique. And but yeah, it doesn't just happen for projectiles when it comes to knowing what the enemy is doing, even though it is very useful for that too. But
and this comes down to like much more than that, right? Like I feel like know what your enemy is doing is a concept that you can always improve at all levels, because there's always that one more thing that you can be aware of, one more thing that you can be paying attention to, one more thing that you can be reading from your opponent, right? If you maybe from the back of your head see that tracer blink all the way to the back, and you're McCree, for example, you already know that she's gonna try to flank you, and you can position yourself to kind of like greet that tracer as she's coming into your team and quickly dispose of her. Again, placing your crosser, as this moment she comes across it, you flashbang, kill her, donezo, you move on.
Yeah,
same scenario when you run up against Reinhardt's and Zarya's that start playing very, very aggressively when they weren't prior. You're like, okay, well, am I going to get earth shattered here? That's about a 90 percentile that Reinhardt's walking right at you.
Exactly what I was going to say. Absolutely. Another great example of this is when people look at people like Ryo Jae-hung that land an incredible amount of sleep darts on Genjis. It's infuriating.
Oh, he's insane with those.
Oh my gosh, yes.
I feel like complaining about him because he was in NA for a little while and ruining my games. But
were you taking a nap there, Burdock?
Yes, it was very unfortunate. I'm not a very good Genji, and it really didn't help to have him in my game. So anyway, unfortunately, why did I say unfortunately? That's weird. Anyway, that when you're dealing with somebody like that, it isn't necessarily coming from like sheer aim or prediction, where he has some sort of innate ability to see into the future. A lot of it just comes down to having a very good idea of what the enemy wants to do. If you watch somebody like Ryo Jae-hung, almost constantly he's landing asleep on the Genji when he's pulling out his blade in the air, or right after the first dash occurs. So I think a good example of this is right when the first dash occurs, that okay, well, the Genji looks like he's about to jump our Mercy or jump our whatever, and you just start lining up your sleep dart to go towards that person. And that it's really consistent, that if you know what the person's going to do before they actually do it, and you can a lot of times in this game, you're going to be able to line up your shots a lot better. Or when Genji's pulling out his blade, you can tell what his first target is. The Genjis are always just going to jump into the air and start scanning for targets. And then the one they just start looking towards, they're probably going to dash to.
Yeah, it's like that battle saying that warriors are always at the most open when they're about to finish their enemies, or when they're about to strike. Yeah, it's the same concept when Genji's pulling his dragon blade, or when Reinhardt's about to earth shatter. They're so confident that they're the aggressor and then they have the upper hand that sometimes they're not expecting you to strike back right at that moment. You know what I mean? And if you're able to take advantage of that, read the moment and realize that that's when they're about to do their move, and you're just one step ahead of them, that can be your ticket to victory right there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like, it's really easy to talk about this, but the ability to be able to identify it in the moment where you have a split second to be able to recognize what's about to occur is extremely challenging. And there's a reason that, you can go watch a VOD and be able to accurately pinpoint, like, oh, that Genji's going to ask this person. If you pause it, take 2 seconds. The thing that makes somebody like Ryo Jiang incredibly impressive is to be able to identify that almost habitually. I mean, it's so much to it's instinct. Like, he's not thinking about it. He doesn't have time to. It's something that's so ingrained to be able to recognize those sort of.
Let's build on this specific example, because I think this overlaps quite well with your next 2 points.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's, in short, when we can talk about this at length and you can completely understand the topics, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can execute it in game. And a lot of it just comes down to, you don't get a chance to think when you're actually playing. You have to rely on the habits and the sort of the impulses that
your game knowledge, all this stuff.
Yeah, that it's not something. It's not enough just to know what the right action is to do. If you want to actually execute it and execute it quickly, you have to have made the right decision enough times in the past that it comes very quickly, and you can identify it and execute it within short order.
And it's like you said, Ryo Jiang, for example, it's a guy that is very adept at identifying this moment, but there's a lot of variables that allow him to identify these moments, right? Like, he already maybe has like an idea of how long every hero takes to build their ultimate. Based on how the fight has gone, he has an idea if maybe that Genji or that Reinhardt has an ultimate. He also watches the movement of that player. Is he changing his behavior? Has he been playing very conservatively the whole match, and now he's getting like very aggressive all of a sudden? Or like you said, is he dashing up in the air? All these are kind of like telltale signs. And if you're expecting it, if you already know, okay, this, I can smell a Genji ult right here or very close to here, and then you see those signs, you can immediately react, but you were already prepared in your head for that moment.
Absolutely. I mean, the great example of this is just where if you watch some of Ryo Jae-hong's scrim games, quite often you'll notice that as soon as a Genji dashes into the air, he looks up to the peak of it and then drops his crosshair a little bit below the Genji and starts pulling out a sleep dart, even if the Genji doesn't ult. And it's essentially because there's, I think, one time I've ever seen that in a game where the Genji doesn't ult. If the Genji's dashing into the air, you're gonna get dragon bladed. So it becomes such a consistent sign. And a lot of this is being very, very good at recognizing really obvious things very quickly. Like your example is a Reinhardt getting aggressive. The difference between somebody that is a really good player and a decent player is that the really good player will identify it the moment the first oddly aggressive thing happens, where a decent player might notice it after maybe a second or two.
Or once the earth shatter is coming down on his face.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, I'm getting earth shattered right now. Thank you.
That explains why he was running straight at me.
So a lot of this isn't like trying to make some sort of clever mind games, because that's not very consistent. What you really want to do is be really good at being able to predict the things that are obvious signs very quickly.
Cool. Let's go into the other 2 points really quickly, because they're important too. And one of these I hadn't even thought about, but it is one of the reasons, especially why newer players have such a hard time aiming vertically, and it's called shadow angles. Why don't you explain that to us?
Yeah, so the general idea is that when we're aiming in an FPS game, we have really weird axes. That on the y-axis, when you move up and down, it's completely consistent. That if you're moving up, if you're moving down, the motion doesn't curve at all. It's always a straight line on your screen. But if you're moving left and right, if you're at roughly horizontal, like head height, or looking at the horizon, so to speak, you're going to have a straight line. But if you start looking up, it's sort of like spinning a top, so to speak. You're drawing a smaller circle, which ends up actually curving your. It looks like your
has a small
curvature.
Up. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, if you're looking directly up and you start moving left and right, it actually is just spinning you around. You're not actually moving your crosshair at all. It just rotates you. And it's a very, very, or if you're looking at your feet, it's the same thing. Essentially, the more off the plane of the horizon you are, the more it's going to curve up or down. So if you're looking up, it's going to curve up. If you're looking down, it's going to curve down. And because of this, when you're aiming at these shallow angles, when you're aiming close to 0 degrees from the ground or 180 degrees up, you're going to have that curvature, which is going to throw off your muscle memory, and there's no way around it. Things like flicks are going to be much more difficult, especially long flicks. And tracking, you're going to still have to expend a little bit of extra muscle movements and brain power to be able to actually compensate for it correctly. So there's a couple ways to actually mitigate this. One is just use the other aiming techniques more, place more shots when you're aiming at shallow angles, and use more like actual movement of your character. Yeah, like for example, if you want to deal with a Pharaoh really well that's almost directly above you, move at the same rate that she is. So like move backwards if she's moving towards you, or move forwards if she's backing away from you, because that'll compensate for that movement and make it a lot easier to shoot her. And she can hit you if she's directly above you. Like,
right.
You have to try anyway. So,
and granted, you can still practice aiming at these angles. It's not like you can't aim vertically at all. You can also get really good at that. But the moment you realize that there is this curvature, if you hadn't thought about it before, then you can start approaching it a different way, like you said, maybe using strafing or placing a little more rather than flicking, because you know that it's going to be an awkward angle to aim at it if you're trying to do it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good example of why it's so hard to shoot like Genjis that jump right over your head, because if you look up, you're then going to have to move your mouse essentially for a 180-degree turn and then go down to actually, like, you can't aim up past directly above you. So if they pass directly above you, you get this really awkward situation of like you have to look all the way up and then turn 180 degrees and then start looking down. And it's, no matter how much experience you have, it's still a pretty janky motion to do.
Right,
so
and you might end up on a weird corner of your mouse pad when you now have to like recompensate kind of thing.
Yeah, it's not fun to deal with, no matter how you slice it. And the last one is just is the aiming at people's knees when dealing with really unpredictable AD spam and certain heroes. And it just really comes down to understanding the hitboxes in Overwatch, that everyone's basically a triangle. That you can actually test this if you'd like, and just go into a game, like have somebody play soldier or something else, and then try shooting right next to their head, and then try shooting right next to the legs. And you'll notice that the hitbox is actually quite noticeably larger. But most of the heroes are like slight triangles, and because of this.
Sorry, I gotta interrupt. This is like the one thing that I learned the best when, or the most, the best. What am I saying? The one thing I learned the most when I was looking at the video that you had linked with this. So I highly encourage you guys, go find the link and click the video for this, because it is perfectly illustrated with the Ana sleep darts. Like, the amount of consistency I was seeing, which is just unreal, because what's happening is I was seeing on the Ana screen, when you line up the shot, you're aiming, predictively, of course, and almost a little bit of placement for the movement of whatever character you're trying to sleep dart for the feet and the knees. But what ends up happening is by the time the dart hits them, it looks as if the dart registers hitting them in the chest, even though it's hitting them in the feet. As far as the animation's concerned, it looked very janky, but I started understanding this more, because I was like, well, this explains why it looks like all the pros are sleeping people right in the chest. I was like always adjusting my aim for hitting in the chest, and it's still missing when they do the 80 spamming you're talking about.
Yeah, it looks like that quite often too, just because the fall rate of people, that even if like on the client it registers as hitting their feet, it might look like you slept them in the chest because they're falling. So this weird jankiness of, like, especially when you have a little bit of lag thrown in there and interpolation, that where things land and where they actually landed don't always align. So just keep that in mind.
You kind of have to have a feel for them sometimes.
Well, the awkward thing about interpolation is it makes things objectively more reliable, but makes them look less reliable, which is this really it's this terrible feeling thing where, like, that people it's anyway, no reason to go into netcode detail, but it's awkward. But anyway, so like characters that really benefit from this is like Zarya, for example, where this is really obviously helpful because she has a beam that you can't get headshots with. Aiming like at knees or waist level when somebody's AD spamming against you it's just better. Just do it. And as another example of this, where aiming towards the lower end of somebody's hitbox is advantageous. Now, keep in mind, if somebody's jumping, most characters jump about half to 2/3 of their body length up. So, that they might dodge this shot, but good players don't usually jump a tremendous amount. So, because it is disadvantageous in literally every other way, unless somebody's aiming at your feet. So that's why, I generally don't recommend directly aiming at somebody's feet and closer to knees or basically just
thighs.
Just be aware that the hitbox gets bigger the lower it is. With characters other than Roadhog or Zen, because they're just bricks.
He's a giant square.
Yeah, exactly. Zen gets the short.
You heard it here first, guys. Roadhog's a giant square.
Yes. Being Zen is awful. Just having a tracer come up to you and land every shot as a headshot.
Remind me.
Ooh, it's fun. But anyway,
the head hitbox is ginormous.
But you can definitely benefit with characters like Soldier with this too. If you have somebody that's 80 spamming you and they're on quarter health, shoot at their feet. Just go full auto.
You don't have to get fancy. Yeah, you just go for the guaranteed kill or the low hanging fruit, right? The easiest part to hit.
Yeah.
Even the best players in this game, you look at the incredible tracer players or soldier players, and quite often they rarely get much above 50% accuracy. That you'd be surprised how much the difference between somebody that's an average player and the difference between a pro player isn't reaction time or muscle memory or sorry, it is muscle memory. That it's not so much reaction time or uncanny stuff. It's a lot more that everything is set up in their favor to win before anything happens, and pre-aiming corners or knowing move speeds by heart, and having the hand-eye coordination to be able to execute it, but there's a lot of knowledge and practice that goes into it.
We have one more main topic before you get into kind of the advice and what you want to get into for bettering your aim, which is movement terminology. We have jumping, which we touched on briefly with the hitboxes. We have crouching, which is also something that somewhat you may be exposed to with what we call AD spamming or moving left and right very quickly. Sometimes people will weave in crouches. And then we have stutter stepping, which is mixing up how you move side to side from A and D. It basically makes it so that you move a little bit or maybe even stop in your tracks before you move the opposite direction or the same direction by stuttering your movements to be irregular. So let's jump into maybe this is one big catch-all statement or
we'll
synopsis,
just
and then we
really
go into
quickly.
the advice.
Yeah, let's brush over it because I think it's important, but we are running a little bit out of time, so let's at least mention them.
Yeah, so I think as far as important is concerned, I would honestly say that movement is just as important to aiming, if not more, because they're inextricably intertwined substantially. That a lot of stuff I'm talking about, with pre-aiming corners and paying attention to that kind of stuff, and the movement is tied into that a lot. That there's a lot to be done by positioning and movement that will affect your aim substantially. But anyway, on the subject of just the things you can do with movement, we have the obvious ones: jumping, you press space. And crouching, where you press control, or whatever key you have it bound to. But what's a little bit more interesting about these is when you should actually be doing it. Because if you've noticed, jumping is really easy to shoot people, because there's not a lot of air strafing in this game. So as soon as somebody jumps, they have a pretty fixed trajectory, which makes them very easy to shoot.
It makes them very predictable.
Yeah, exactly. That once you have a bit of experience with the game, it's one of those things that fall speeds and movement speeds are very easily memorizable. And jumping is basically locks you into your fall speed and your move speed. So
I actually remember when I first started playing this game, I would jump all over the place. I was so proud of myself because I was like, man, I'm making myself so hard to hit right now. I'm just jumping and jumping. And then I remember shortly after I started to play this game, I just realized one day, man, I'm just making my life really hard. It's harder to aim for me, and I'm making myself actually easier to hit by just jumping all over the place.
Yeah, I guess the only exception to this is avoiding splash, or two major exceptions. Avoiding splash damage.
In certain situations, is valuable. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, or a few scatter shots. The other one is that where you best ability of the game. What are you talking about? The other one is just maintaining speed when you're scoping. Some people do this with Anna and Widow, where they jump around a corner.
Or picking corners with them. Yeah.
It can be advantageous there, but generally speaking, you don't want to do a lot of use jump sparingly.
when
For
appropriate.
movement, it's from point A to point B, and that's it.
Use jumping for jumping purposes, not spamming purposes. So yeah. Crouching though is something that's quite often underused, especially by people like Gold and below. That it's very, very valuable because it changes your model size slightly and it slows you down. Now, it might be strange saying slowing you down, but anything that changes your movement speed can be useful. Unfortunately, though, you definitely don't want to do it for too long because then you're just a slow, boxier moving target. So it's something that is good to throw into AD spam every once in a while, just to throw somebody off, especially against characters like, let's say, Widowmaker, McCree, or even Hanzo, where you can dodge those headshots because you're moving your head up and down. But don't spam it very often. Like, if we're talking about you're standing in front of somebody and you're doing some strafing or whatever, maybe throw in 1 or 2, but if you're throwing in like 8 or you're crouching for more than like 1/3 of a second.
It's more of a thing you mix in there to kind of throw off the opponent every once in a while.
Yeah, basically you press the button and you release it immediately. You don't hold it. Like you hold it for at most maybe like 300 milliseconds or like about 1/3 of a second at most.
It is very satisfying. Sorry, I was gonna say it's very satisfying when you're in that Widow duel and you hold it and you just see the shot just go right by your head and then you come back up.
It is fantastic. Yeah, but anyway, long story short, it's like use it, but use it sparingly. The other useful piece of information is that obviously it reduces the sound, but if you spam crouch, you can actually just keep the full footstep sound from playing. So you just get like basically the start of the footstep sound, which usually is the loudest part. So like this is something that Effect does all the time, and I like him as a player.
He's a good player.
He's okay at this game.
Yeah,
like,
he's all right.
He might be like one of, if not the best Tracer players in this game, but he's okay. Anyway, that you can basically spam crouch to be able to reduce most of the noise and still not completely ruin your move speed. So that's definitely something I'd recommend.
That's a pretty cool technique, actually, and a little advanced. Not a lot of people use that, but if you want to do that, yeah, keep some of your speed and reduce some of your noise. That's really nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sabayobi does this a lot as well. Like
Yeah.
I'll see him like especially on the Eichenwald like map when they were playing against the USA from the Korea match at BlizzCon. He was basically just going in rooms, just duck to maintain his main speed.
Sayobi is honestly one of the most perfect examples of the stuff being discussed here because a lot of people underestimate him because he's not necessarily the most flashy mechanical player. He's not the person with the fastest reaction time or the most insane flicks or best tracking. But he usually just makes fights easy before they start. Like he's always
just a very technical, smart player.
Exactly.
Finesse.
He is very good about making sure that the execution is very tight and not necessarily relying on out mechanically executing somebody. Is just being optimal and being like, I'll assume I'm bad and win anyway by making it easy.
Right. It makes it easier on him and on his team.
Yeah, I think that's in general. No matter how good you are, just take easy fights. Like, don't make it hard on yourself. Make it easy on yourself. Anytime you can make the game easier, do it.
Make decisions for you.
Yeah, like flick shots are cool. Try not to make them if you don't have to. Like, you shouldn't have to make them. It shouldn't be your go-to thing. Like, there's a lot of other stuff that you can win easier. Like, if you're McCree and you're not flashing somebody that's in front of you, like, what are you doing? I've seen players that are in like Masters and super confident that like never use flashbang against a Tracer. What's going on here? You trying to prove something? So anyway, back to the topic here about stutter stepping. That this is basically like spamming left and right or A and D to make it hard to hit you. The only thing to really say about this is that when people are AD spamming, the most significant difference of like why somebody wins and somebody doesn't is usually the person with better movement, not the person with better aim. I notice a lot of people will like either spam AD too quickly, which is essentially like not moving, because you don't even move a full body. You're like move like a tenth of the model one way and then a tenth of the model the other way. So if somebody's aiming in the center, like they're still hitting you, or they do like 1 second in one direction and 1 second in the other. And most decent players can track that. Like if we're taking into account average reaction time of like 200 milliseconds, and then let's say it takes 100 milliseconds for it to hit their screen and then to react to it. Like if you're going for much longer than half a second, they're going to just react to it and track you. So usually you want to be, I don't know, like around a half a second, maybe even a little less. And don't just do A and D. and this is sort of immediately jumping into one of the other topics and the general advice is you can also just not move for a second. That
Hold up.
I know this is, yeah, exactly. That it is amazing how much this will throw off even incredibly good players, but not moving is really annoying. I think Birdring is the person that I've seen do this the most as Tracer, and oh my god, is it annoying! Where he'll blink somewhere and then not move, or move the opposite direction he blinked, to just completely screw with your head, because you'll
Absolutely, you're not expecting it at all.
Yeah, exactly. You'll just duck and just stay there for like. You'll never do it for more than like. Not even a half a second, even less than that.
Yeah.
It's a split second. But what you do is you just sort of assume that they're moving in their current way, because that's like your brain is at like about a 300 millisecond delay most of the time, because it's not like you're just reacting like those reaction time tests where some color changes. You're having to react and be able to make like a decision based on it and then move your hand. Like it's even worse than that. So
yeah, absolutely.
It can be incredibly frustrating when people abuse that.
And all of this kind of goes hand in hand with the same thing. And it also with your general advice, you say don't run straight for cover, and I think all of these other things are speaking to that, right? You want to make yourself as unpredictable as possible, and these are just techniques that you can use to make yourself that unpredictable. If you're a person that it's AD spamming and then crouching and then kind of stops for a second and then keeps moving again, your opponent's never going to be able to like pinpoint like what is this guy trying to do right now, and you're just that much harder to kill all the time. There's also two other little topics that you put over here: abusing rate of fire and also saying you can dodge everything. I think those two are pretty interesting, and we can kind of close out the discussion with those two.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a number of things you can abuse. You can abuse people's reaction time with things like stutter stepping and or just stopping. But there's also a couple other things. You can abuse turn speed, because most people take a second to turn around. There's actually an example in here of one player I was talking about, Birdring, being a really, really difficult Tracer to hit just by continually blinking through somebody, or I think it was Taimu that he's playing against.
Yeah,
Taimu on Widow.
And just being infuriating, because it takes a certain amount of time to turn around, and you can be really consistent with this. And like, I've literally seen Effect kill a aimbot soldier by doing this, because the aimbot won't make you turn 180 degrees. So the low health soldier literally died to his Tracer because he had 3 blinks. It was amazing. I couldn't find the clip, but that's what I wanted to put in there.
And I've actually kind of been trying to practice a little more lately. Playing Tracer, while you're blinking, you can turn 180 degrees as you're blinking. So by the time that you end the blink, you're already facing backwards and shooting at the person. And you can really abuse this. If you shoot behind them and you're already shooting at them, you can see the moment when they start to turn. And the second you see that, you can kind of rinse and repeat, just blink again behind them. And it has to be like the most infuriating feeling for the other person, because they're basically always turning, but they can never see you. And eventually they're just pulling their hairs, being like, where the hell is this Tracer? And it's all up to you, kind of like keeping that pace, the timing, and being like one step ahead of them.
Okay, so I'm gonna nerd out Ryo Jae-hong a little bit here, because he has a really, really low sensitivity. So he has a more difficult time than most turning around.
Mm-hmm.
And playing Tracer against him, or playing Tracer against normal, like most people, I've gotten pretty used to that. Like in GM top 500, most players take, like, I can get about 10, 15 bullets off before they'll turn around. Maybe a little bit less if I'm not perfect with my 180, but that's about the number. So to counteract that, Ryo Jae-hong just won't turn and just wait for you to blink the other way and then sleep you, and he's an asshole. So yeah, that. There's ways you can counteract this.
There you go. But then he's staying one step ahead of you.
He's
at
predicting
that point.
the prediction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So like if you look at Taimu, for example, like if he started to turn around and then just flicked back and faked out Birdring, that would have been sick. Except for that would have also been really hard to do, because it's really hard to play these mind games, but it's really fun when you start getting to that level of play.
The end of that clip with Taimu and Birdring is also really funny, because they're just dancing around out there, and Birdring like runs out of ammo at some point, and he just like blink melee, and then like at the top of Hanamura map, when Taimu's supposed to be engaging on point 2, there's a Zenyatta that just headshots him and like walks away. It was like the funniest way to end the fight.
It was fantastic. So, and then we'll go the last two things here, since we're on a time schedule here and got to finish up. Is that fire rate? You can definitely abuse this. This is awesome. Everything from like knowing when a charging Zenyatta will want to release. Like for example, either they want to do a full charge, or maybe if you're playing Tracer, it's like 2 that will kill you. So you want to blink right around 2 charges or two orbs.
And there are some heroes that you can time really well. For example, Roadhog or Zarya with alternate fire, or even Pharah. All those heroes have kind of like a cadence to a rhythm to their fire rate, and you can really, really pay attention to that and kind of play to that rhythm.
Yeah, in here actually there's a link to effect being evil, and screwing with a Roadhog while he's trying to retreat just by stopping right between every attack.
Is it the
infuriating person.
Is it the soldier and I can
Yes, it's that one. It's
I've actually referenced that clip in the show before, because when I saw it happen, I was like, oh my god. He wasn't even like AD spamming or anything. He was literally stopping in his tracks, and the Roadhog would just kind of like fire ahead of him, and he was keeping the time of the Roadhog shots, and he basically dodges all of them, and I was so impressed.
Roadhog
I was like,
went
wow.
uninstalled after that.
Yeah.
So
okay. My proudest moment in this game was playing against I think it was Agilities, and being able to get away from him because his shurikens are really good. By just stopping his Tracer and just watching the 3 shurikens go in front of my face. And it was just one moment of just watching 3 shurikens go by my face while I blinked around a corner. But just that felt fantastic. Nice. And we'll take small victories because I'm bad.
The small ones.
Yeah, there you go.
But and then the last thing is just like you can't dodge and out aim everything. Like on the subject of dodging, like you can do all of this stuff to the one person you're fighting, but all this AD spamming and movement is going to look like doing nothing to anybody that's 90 degrees to you. So if you're doing all this AD spamming, somebody that's to the side of you is just going to see a person that's like moving slightly and towards and away from them.
Right.
They don't have to do
Zenyatta's
anything.
clip was perfect example. He's dealing with Bird Ring for like 10 minutes, and then Zenyatta comes in and is just like, "What are you doing?" and just shoots you in the head and walks away.
Yeah. That you can't do this to everyone. And really, this is where like mechanics end and game sense and positioning begins. Is that if you're exposing yourself to a whole bunch of people, you're going to not only have to dodge and play this sort of 1v1 battle, but you're also just going to get shot in the side of the head. And a lot of this game comes down to having really strong mechanics, but also knowing, just basically avoiding using them. That despite having all this conversation about these, if you really want to be effective, even if you have the best mechanics in the world, you're going to want to avoid having to really use them. You want to be using the minimum amount you actually have to. You want to be taking fights where maybe you have one person fighting you, great, okay, you can deal with that. Maybe you have one person that's distracted by another person, or that they are having to turn around before the fight even starts, like it's Tracer. I don't ever want to like blink towards somebody that's already looking at me, ever. And I want to have them have to turn around to begin with, because they already have to deal with this annoying thing about dealing with like turn speed and mechanics before it even starts. And a lot of this comes down to just understanding where the line of mechanics and game sense are sort of drawn, and it's a pretty fuzzy line, and it's something where you really have to sort of use your head to know. I guess the best example of this is using proper technique, the amount of effort that's needed. And, you know, the better somebody is at doing anything, the less effort they'll need to exert on it. And in this case, you know, the better your positioning is, and the better your game sense is, and the more coordinated you are with the team, and the more you're working with your team, the less you will need to mechanically outplay anyone else. And
this is meant to be supportive for you to get into the areas where you can start learning positioning and you can start doing things. But again, remember, techniques for aim and techniques for dodging and movement are only a subsection of the things that we can learn, and breaking it down in these specific orientations help us learn in these camps. So you can bet your britches we're going to try to cover more positioning stuff. I know we did it last year, but we got to do it again, because it's always something you got to brush up on.
Absolutely. And it's probably one of the hardest things to practice because it's so disconnected.
And it's always evolving, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, I think that's going to be the end of the main discussion here with Burdock. And we had a section where it recently came into effect on the PTR, but I don't think we're going to have enough time that I really want to dedicate to discussing it, especially since it happened so fresh before the show.
We can mention
and
the
have some more
changes
time
if
to
you
think
want,
about
but
it.
yeah, there's not much time to
But
go through
I
them.
will mention what it is. Basically, Junkrat on the PTR has received a slight nerf to the concussive mind. The concussive mind, sorry. And
The
and
concussive
nerf meaning that
mind.
the concussive mind. Basically the mind of Junkrat. What happens when you throw the mine is he still will have the 2 charges of the mine, but there is a hard fall-off damage within the explosion radius. So in order to get the full 120 damage from the mine, it has to be right around where the initial explosion is, and the damage fall-off is very harsh, where you can only be dealing about 60 or 30 damage with the explosion if it's not close enough to the target. The next change is that Mercy's Valkyrie got yet another rework that has people in a fuss, and including myself, not so much because I'm a Mercy and support player, but because all of the solutions to Mercy are reworks and not slight adjustments. So here are the adjustments for Valkyrie again. They will no longer allow Resurrect to become instant and no longer give you a bonus charge during Valkyrie. The speed boost when you use your Guardian Angel or your dash ability to allies has been lowered by 50%. And then the overall duration of Valkyrie used to be 20 seconds and is now down to 15. So that will be mentioned so you guys are informed. You can discuss that in the Discord. We'll most likely cover this at length a little bit more so next week, but we wanted to make sure that you were aware. The last thing here is the people that do want to support the show beyond Patreon. If you guys like the show, please leave us an iTunes review. We are now rolling in a lot of iTunes reviews. We got 4 this week, which is a lot higher than normal, and I really appreciate it. Got some people just saying, hey, support the show, just so I can voice that. So we got people like Scorpion Z9, Clint K, Cody Alfar, and Takarin. Thank you guys so much for your iTunes reviews. Please continue to do these, guys. It helps us a lot get noticed, get found, and also gives us a chance to get some of your feedback directly. If you, we're still trying some new things to make sure the show format is best suited for everyone, and especially those of you who are going into the back of the archives. We can only do so much as we can't readjust previously published shows like you guys are wanting us to. So just keep that in mind when you do submit your feedback. If you want to find the show, the best way to find the show, if you also want to support the show on Twitch, we are Twitch affiliates, and you guys can use your Twitch subs or your Amazon Prime subs there, and we will benefit from that. So we really appreciate that. If you want to find the show, the best way to do that is go to the website, omniclab.com/links. We'll get you hooked up with Twitter, the Facebook, the Patreon, the Twitch, the YouTube, and our merch store. If you guys want a coffee mug or a sweatshirt or a hoodie for your winter vacation, there you go. You can find those there. And if you want to contact Burdock, he is not accessible on Twitter and also on Twitch, at least for now. So you guys can actually access him through at messaging him in our Discord at Burdock, BURDOCK. And thank you again for joining us on the show, dude. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. That was an awesome discussion on AIM. And since I saw your topic, I was like, man, I want to have that guy on the show. That was really good discussion.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andres, where can people find you?
If you want to personally find me, you can look me up on Twitter at iPlayGames. You spell that IPLAI Games. Also catch my Overwatch League recap show, the Overwatch League recap, or the Owl recap, however you want to call it. Look it up at owlrecap.com.
If you want to find me, I'm on Twitter and Instagram with the tag NotRob. I also stream occasionally on the Omnic Lab channel as well as my personal channel at NotRobMay. If you guys like Hearthstone, we'll be recording our next episode tomorrow. Not on Twitch, but it's called Velen's Chosen. And I believe we're going to be covering a combination of 2 decks this week. And I'm really interested because the meta has been evolving so crazily in the last couple weeks, where some of the top decks have just kind of like been ignored this last week. And it's been really, really crazy. So you guys are going to want to tune into that if you like Hearthstone. We're also going to be starting to slowly release 2 more lore-only exclusive episodes. So you guys can go check that out in the feed. We have our first History of Azeroth already uploaded. And that'll do it for episode 85 of the Omnic Lab, Advanced Aim Techniques with the man, the myth, the Redditor, Burdock. Thank you guys for joining us. Remember, don't be a lab rat, be a scientist. We'll see you guys next week. enjoy your Overwatch games, and good luck climbing.
Thanks to everyone that stopped in the chat. I know it's a little later than the usual time, but that went pretty well. Oh, shoot.
The abrupt ending.
I abruptly ended Senyata, and the best part is okay. Normally I add all this stuff post. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Sorry for cutting out Senyata there. We'll catch you guys later. See you later.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, guys.